The Arizona Territory in the spring of 1885 was a land caught between seasons, winter's grip loosening its hold while summer's heat gathered strength in the desert distances. Morning mist still clung to the valleys when the sun was right, but by midday the earth would shimmer with the promise of the brutal months ahead. Tom Brennan led his exhausted horse toward the weathered barn that sat like a lonely monument in the vastness of his small ranch. 3 days of tracking rustlers through the Superstition Mountains had left both man and beast bone-tired, covered in dust, and eager for nothing more than food, water, and rest. Tom was 31 years old, with a kind of lean, weathered build that came from a lifetime of hard work under an unforgiving sun. His brown hair had been bleached lighter by years of desert exposure, and his blue eyes held the quiet wariness of a man who had learned to expect trouble from every horizon. The ranch wasn't much to look at: a modest adobe house, a few outbuildings, and enough grazing land to support a small herd of cattle and horses. Tom had built it all with his own hands over the past 7 years, slowly carving out a life from the harsh landscape through sheer determination and careful planning. It was a bachelor's spread, practical and functional without any of the touches that would have marked a woman's influence. As Tom approached the barn, his tired horse nickered softly and pricked its ears forward, the way horses do when they sense something unusual but not necessarily threatening. Tom's hand instinctively moved toward the Colt .44 at his hip, his senses sharpening despite his exhaustion. Living alone in Apache country had taught him never to ignore his horse's warnings. The barn doors stood slightly ajar, though Tom was certain he had secured them properly before leaving 3 days ago. A thin line of golden morning light sliced through the opening, illuminating dancing dust motes and casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor inside. Everything appeared normal, but something felt wrong in the way that experienced frontiersmen learn to trust without question. Tom dismounted carefully, his spurs jingling softly in the morning stillness. He could hear his cattle lowing in the distance, and the familiar creak of his windmill turning lazily in the gentle breeze. But underneath these normal ranch sounds was something else, a rhythm so soft and regular that it took him a moment to identify it. Breathing. Human breathing, slow and deep, with the cadence of sleep. Tom drew his pistol with practiced silence and approached the barn door. Years of solitary living had made him cautious about unexpected visitors, whether they came on 2 legs or 4. In his experience, people who hid in other men's barns were usually running from something, and what they were running from had a way of following them. He pushed the door open slowly, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim interior while his ears strained for any sound of movement. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and horse sweat filled his nostrils, but underneath them was something different: wood smoke, sage, and something indefinably feminine that made his pulse quicken. In the corner of the barn, nestled in a pile of fresh hay like a sleeping wildcat, was the most beautiful woman Tom had ever seen. Her long black hair spread around her like a dark waterfall, and her face, even in sleep, held a kind of serene strength that spoke of noble bloodlines and untamed spirit. She wore traditional Apache clothing, a duskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the morning light, silver jewelry that marked her as someone of importance, and moccasins that showed the wear of long travel. Tom holstered his weapon, suddenly feeling foolish for drawing it on a sleeping woman. But even as he relaxed his guard, his mind raced with questions. How had she gotten here? Why was she alone? And most importantly, what was an Apache woman doing sleeping in his barn when relations between her people and white settlers remained tense and often deadly? As if sensing his presence, the woman's eyes opened slowly. They were dark and intelligent, with depths that seemed to hold secrets Tom couldn't begin to guess. For a moment, neither of them moved, each taking the measure of the other in the golden dust-filled light of the barn. When she spoke, her English was clear and precise, though accented with the musical cadence of her native language. "I mean no harm to you or your horses, Cowboy. I was seeking only shelter for the night." Tom found his voice after a moment of surprise. "Ma'am, you're welcome to the shelter, but I have to ask, how did you get here? And why are you traveling alone?" The woman sat up gracefully, arranging her dress with the unconscious dignity of someone accustomed to being looked at and judged. "My name is Itzel, daughter of Chief Nealnish of the Chiricahua. I am traveling to the San Carlos Reservation to join what remains of my family there." Tom caught the hesitation in her voice and the shadow that crossed her face when she mentioned the reservation. San Carlos was known throughout the territory as a place where Apache spirits went to die a harsh, unforgiving collection of government buildings and military barracks, where proud warriors were turned into dependent wards of the federal bureaucracy. That's a long way to travel alone, Miss Itzel. Dangerous country between here and there. All country is dangerous for Apache now, she replied with quiet dignity. At least traveling alone. I endanger no one but myself. Tom studied her face, noting the exhaustion that she couldn't quite hide behind her proud composure. Her clothes showed the wear of long travel, and despite her attempt to maintain Apache stoicism, he could see that she was near the end of her physical and emotional reserves. When did you last eat? He asked gently. The question seemed to surprise her, as if she had expected interrogation or threats rather than concern for her welfare. Yesterday morning, I had some dried meat, but it is gone now. Tom made a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it at the time. Well, that settles it. You'll come up to the house for breakfast, and we'll figure out what to do from there. Itzel looked at him with something that might have been suspicion or might have been hope. Why would you help Apache woman? Your people and mine, we are not friends. Tom considered the question seriously. Maybe not. But right now you're not an Apache woman, and I'm not a white settler. You're a hungry person in need of help, and I'm someone who can provide it. Sometimes that's all that matters. The walk from the barn to Tom's modest adobe house was filled with an awkward silence that spoke of two people trying to navigate the treacherous waters of racial tension and cultural misunderstanding. Itzel moved with the fluid grace of someone raised in harmony with the natural world, her moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. Tom found himself stealing glances at her profile, struck by the way the morning light played across her high cheekbones and the determined set of her jaw. The house was neat and functional, with the sparse decorations and practical furniture of a man who lived alone and had little use for frills. But it was clean and well-maintained, with touches that spoke of someone who took pride in his home even if he didn't have anyone to share it with. Tom gestured toward a chair at his small wooden table, while he moved to the stove to prepare breakfast. Coffee? He asked, already reaching for the pot. Please. Itzel settled into the chair with careful dignity, her dark eyes taking in every detail of Tom's home. You live here alone? 7 years now. Tom pumped water into the coffee pot and set it on the stove to heat. Built this place from nothing after I mustered out of the cavalry. Itzel's expression shifted slightly at the mention of his military service. You fought Apache? Tom paused in his breakfast preparations, understanding that his answer would determine whether the fragile trust between them continued or shattered completely. I served in the territory during some of the conflicts, yes, but I was never involved in any of the incidents that both sides would probably prefer to forget. It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging the massacres and atrocities that had marked the Apache Wars without taking responsibility for actions he hadn't committed. Itzel seemed to understand the distinction, and some of the tension went out of her shoulders. What made you leave the army? She asked. Tom cracked eggs into a skillet and began preparing what would probably be the most unusual breakfast of his life. Got tired of following orders that didn't make much sense. Decided I'd rather build something than spend my life tearing things down. As he cooked, Tom found himself stealing glances at Itzel, trying to reconcile her presence in his kitchen with everything he thought he knew about Apache culture. She was clearly a woman of high status. Her clothing and jewelry spoke of wealth and position, but she was also traveling alone through dangerous country, apparently fleeing from something she couldn't or wouldn't name. When breakfast was ready, eggs, bacon, biscuits, and coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead, Tom set a plate before his unexpected guest and watched as she ate with the controlled urgency of someone who had been hungry for too long. Her table manners were impeccable, suggesting either natural refinement or exposure to white customs, but she made no attempt to hide her appreciation for the food. This is very good, she said between bites. It has been some time since I have eaten food prepared by someone else. How long have you been traveling? Tom asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own plate. Itzel was quiet for a moment, as if calculating not just distance but the cost of her journey in ways that couldn't be measured in miles. 6 weeks. Maybe 7. Time becomes unclear. When you are always moving, 6 weeks. Tom tried to imagine what could drive a woman of obvious status and refinement to spend 6 weeks alone in some of the most dangerous country in America. That would put your starting point somewhere around the Dragoon Mountains. Itzel finished for him. My father's winter camp, before the soldiers came. The way she said before the soldiers came told Tom everything he needed to know about why she was fleeing and why she couldn't go back. The Dragoon Mountains had been the site of several military actions over the past few months, most of them ending badly for the Apache bands that had been trying to live peacefully in their traditional territories. "I'm sorry," Tom said simply, understanding that condolences were inadequate but necessary. Itzel nodded acceptance of his sympathy, then looked directly into his eyes with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Why do you help me?" "The truth, not the polite words you said before." Tom set down his coffee cup and considered the question seriously. The honest answer was complicated, involving his growing disillusionment with the way the Apache conflicts were being handled, his natural inclination to help people in need, and something else, a growing fascination with this remarkable woman who had appeared in his barn like a character from a dream. "Because," he said finally, "I've spent 7 years building a life out here, and in all that time, I've never met anyone who made me question what that life was for. You've been here 2 hours, and already I'm thinking about things I haven't thought about in years." Itzel studied his face as if trying to read the truth behind his words. "What kind of things?" "Things like whether a man can build something meaningful, if he's building it entirely for himself. Things like whether it's possible for two people from different worlds to find common ground. Things like what it might be like to share a life with someone instead of just enduring it alone." It was perhaps the most honest thing Tom had said to another human being in years, and the vulnerability of the admission left him feeling exposed and uncertain. But Itzel didn't mock his words or dismiss them as the romantic foolishness of a lonely bachelor. Instead, she regarded him with something that might have been respect. "You speak of things I have also thought about during my travels," she said quietly. "The Apache way of life is ending, and those of us who survive must find new ways to live. Perhaps the old divisions between our peoples need not define what we become." It was a delicate acknowledgement of the attraction that was growing between them, wrapped in the diplomatic language of people who understood that their feelings existed in defiance of history, politics, and social convention. Tom reached across the table and gently touched her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of a life of work and hardship, but also the softness that remained despite everything she had endured. "Itzel," he said carefully, "I don't know what brought you to my barn, and I don't know what you're running from, but I want you to know that you're safe here, for as long as you want to stay." Her fingers intertwined with his, and for a moment, the kitchen was filled with a silence that spoke of possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine before this moment. Over the following days, Tom found his carefully ordered bachelor's life transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Itzel proved to be far more than just a beautiful refugee seeking temporary shelter. She possessed skills and knowledge that complemented his own understanding of desert survival, bringing an Apache perspective to the business of wresting a living from the harsh Arizona landscape. She knew which plants could provide both nutrition and medicine, how to predict weather changes by observing animal behavior, and how to find water in places where Tom would never have thought to look. Under her guidance, his vegetable garden began to flourish with varieties of beans, corn, and squash that were perfectly adapted to the desert climate. But it was the transformation in the atmosphere of his home that struck Tom most powerfully. Where before there had been only the functional silence of a man living alone, now there was conversation, laughter, and the subtle music of another person moving through the rooms. Itzel had a way of making small improvements that enhanced comfort without changing the essential character of the place. Wildflowers in a pottery jar, herbs hung to dry from the kitchen rafters, and a way of arranging furniture that made the modest rooms feel more spacious and welcoming. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set behind the distant mountains, while sharing stories of their vastly different childhoods. Tom told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about the restless wandering that had led him west, and about the satisfaction he had found in building something with his own hands. Itzel spoke of learning to read the desert's moods from her grandmother, of ceremonies that connected her people to the land in ways white settlers rarely understood, and of watching that ancient way of life slowly disappearing under the pressure of military campaigns and government policies. What struck Tom most deeply was Itzel's remarkable adaptability. She had been raised as Apache royalty, accustomed to the respect and deference due to a chief's daughter, but she approached the practical necessities of frontier life with enthusiasm and intelligence. She learned to cook on his wood stove, to tend his horses with a skill that amazed him, and to help with ranch chores that would have challenged many men. "You don't have to work so hard," Tom told her one afternoon as he found her mending a section of fence with the same meticulous attention to detail she brought to everything. "I do not work hard," Itzel replied with a smile that transformed her serious face. "I work to be useful." A woman without usefulness is a woman without honor. You'd have honor whether you lifted a finger or not, Tom said, meaning every word. Itzel paused in her work and looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude with something deeper. In my world, a woman's honor comes from her contributions to her family and her people. Here, with you, I am learning that honor can also come from choosing to build something good with someone who values what you bring. It was during the second week of her stay that Tom realized he was falling in love with her, not just with her beauty, which was considerable, but with her courage, her intelligence, and her remarkable ability to find joy and purpose even after losing everything that had once defined her identity. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. Relationships between white settlers and Apache women were not just socially unacceptable. They could be dangerous for both parties. There were white men who would consider any such relationship a betrayal of racial loyalty, and Apache who would see it as collaboration with the enemy. If they chose to build a life together, they would be creating something unprecedented, with no social structures to support them and plenty of people who would prefer to see them fail. But as Tom watched Itzel working in his garden, singing softly in Apache while she tended plants that would feed them both through the coming winter, he found himself caring less about social acceptance and more about the possibility of sharing his life with someone who understood both its challenges and its rewards. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching stars emerge in the clear desert sky, Tom made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Itzel, he said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that you can answer honestly without worrying about hurting my feelings or changing what we have here. She turned to face him, her expression serious but not afraid. Ask, when you first came here, you were traveling to San Carlos Reservation. You said you were going to join what remained of your family there. Tom paused, trying to find words for questions that had no precedent in his experience. Do you still want to go there? Or, have you found something here that might make you want to stay? Itzel was quiet for a long time, staring out at the moonlit landscape that had become as familiar to her as her childhood homeland. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions that would affect not just their future, but the very definition of who she would become. San Carlos is not a place where Apache go to live, she said finally. It is a place where Apache go to wait for death, while white officials count them like cattle and measure out their lives in government rations. She turned to meet his eyes directly. But this place, with you, feels like somewhere I could live, not as Apache princess hiding from her past, not as white man's woman denying her heritage, but as myself, building something new with someone who sees me as a person rather than a symbol. Tom felt his heart racing as he heard in her words the answer to questions he hadn't dared to ask directly. And what would that look like? Us building something new together? Itzel reached for his hand, her fingers strong and sure as they intertwined with his. It would look like partnership, like respect, like two people from different worlds choosing to create something that belongs entirely to neither world and entirely to both. She paused, then added with a smile that held both mischief and deep affection. And it would look like children who grow up understanding that the best of both cultures is stronger than either culture alone. The proposal, when it came, was nothing like the romantic scenes Tom had read about in the few novels that found their way to frontier trading posts. There were no flowers, no formal speeches, no bending on one knee with a ring that cost 3 months' wages. Instead, it emerged from a conversation about practical matters: how to prepare the ranch for the brutal Arizona summer, whether to expand the garden or focus on improving the pastures, and what they would do when curious neighbors started asking questions about Itzel's presence. There's going to come a time, Tom said as they worked together to repair the roof of his chicken coop, when people are going to want to know what our arrangement is, and I'm not sure she's visiting is going to satisfy them indefinitely. Itzel, balanced gracefully on a ladder while she handed him wooden shingles, considered this with the practical mind that had drawn him to her in the first place. What would satisfy them? Well, if you were my wife, they might not like it, but they'd have to accept it as legal and proper. Tom tried to keep his voice casual, as if he were discussing the price of cattle, rather than proposing marriage to the most remarkable woman he'd ever met. Is that a proposal, or a solution to a social problem? Itzel asked, with amusement in her voice. Tom stopped hammering and looked down at her, suddenly aware that he was handling this badly. It's a proposal disguised as a practical discussion because I'm scared to death that if I ask you properly, you might realize you can do better than a broken-down ex-cavalry rancher with more ambition than sense. Itzel climbed up the ladder until she was at eye level with him, her dark eyes sparkling with an emotion that might have been love. "Thomas Brennan, are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes, ma'am, I believe I am." "And are you asking because you think it would solve social problems, or because you want to spend the rest of your life with me?" Tom set down his hammer and took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that matched his own and the strength that had seen her through trials he could barely imagine. "I'm asking because 3 weeks ago I was a man living alone and thinking that was all I wanted. Now I can't imagine waking up in the morning without knowing you'll be there, or going to sleep at night without hearing you breathing in the room next to mine." "That is better," Itzel said with satisfaction. "Much better. So what's your answer?" She leaned forward and kissed him with a passion that made him forget they were balanced on a ladder 20 feet above the ground. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she smiled with the joy of a woman who had found something she hadn't known she was looking for. "My answer is yes, but with conditions." Tom felt his heart leap and sink simultaneously. "What kind of conditions?" "I will not hide who I am or pretend to be something I'm not to make your neighbors comfortable. I will wear Apache clothing when it pleases me, speak Apache when I choose to, and practice the customs that connect me to my heritage. I wouldn't want you to be anything but exactly who you are, and I will not convert to Christianity unless I choose to do so for my own reasons, not because it's expected of me as a white man's wife." Tom nodded. "Your spiritual beliefs are your own business, and if we have children, they will learn both languages and both ways of understanding the world. They will be proud of both their heritages, not ashamed of either. I'd want that too." Itzel studied his face as if looking for any sign of insincerity or hidden reservation. "And you understand that marrying an Apache woman will make some people your enemy? That there will be those who see our marriage as betrayal or weakness?" Tom thought about the men he knew who would react with anger or disgust to news of his marriage to an Indian woman. Some were neighbors whose friendship he valued. Others were business associates whose respect had taken years to earn. Losing their approval would make his life more difficult and possibly more dangerous. "I understand," he said finally, "and I've decided that I'd rather have their disapproval and your love than their approval and a lifetime of loneliness." Itzel smiled again, and this time it was the radiant expression of a woman who had found her place in the world. "Then my answer is, yes, Thomas Brennan. I will marry you and build a life with you, and bear your children and grow old beside you if the spirits allow it." That evening, as they sat together planning a simple ceremony that would blend Apache traditions with territorial legal requirements, Tom realized that his life had been divided into 2 distinct periods: before Itzel appeared in his barn, and everything that would come after. The second period was going to be far more complicated, challenging, and potentially dangerous than the first. It was also going to be infinitely more rewarding. The wedding took place on a spring morning when the desert was at its most beautiful, painted with wildflowers and filled with the songs of birds celebrating the end of winter. Tom had arranged for a territorial judge to travel out from Tucson to perform the legal ceremony, while Itzel had prepared traditional Apache elements that would make their union meaningful in terms of her own cultural heritage. The guest list was necessarily small and carefully selected. Tom had invited his closest neighbor, Henry Morrison, a fellow rancher who had proven himself to be a man of broad mind and generous spirit. Henry brought his wife Sarah, a practical woman who had welcomed the news of Tom's engagement with curiosity rather than condemnation. "It's about time you found someone," Sarah had told Tom when he nervously broke the news to them a week earlier. "Living alone is all well and good for a while, but a man needs partnership if he's going to build anything lasting." Henry had been more cautious but ultimately supportive. "I won't lie to you, Tom. There are folks around here who won't take kindly to this marriage, but there are also folks who understand that good people are rare enough in this country that we ought to appreciate them wherever we find them." On Itzel's side, there were no family members to invite. Her father was dead, her mother missing, and her siblings scattered to reservations or hiding in the mountains. But she had reached out through the informal network that connected Apache communities across the territory, and on the morning of the wedding, 3 Apache women appeared at Tom's ranch. The eldest was Elena, a medicine woman in her 60s who had known Itzel's grandmother and had traveled 2 days to perform the traditional blessing that would make their marriage meaningful in Apache terms. With her came 2 younger women, cousins of Itzel who had managed to avoid the reservation roundups and were living quietly in the border regions between Arizona and Mexico. The ceremony itself was unlike anything Tom had ever experienced. Judge Harrison performed the legal requirements with efficient dignity, reading from the territorial marriage statutes while Tom and Itzel exchanged simple gold rings that Tom had ordered specially from a jeweler in Phoenix. But it was Elena's Apache ceremony that gave the day its real meaning and power. She burned sage and sweetgrass, while chanting prayers in the ancient language, calling on the spirits of the four directions to bless their union. Itzel wore a traditional Apache wedding dress that her cousins had brought white doskin decorated with silver and turquoise, with a ceremonial shawl that had belonged to her grandmother. The medicine woman spoke of marriage as a partnership between equals, of the importance of maintaining individual strength while building shared purpose, and of the children who would carry forward the best qualities of both their parents' peoples. When she finished, she presented Itzel and Tom with a traditional Apache wedding basket, woven with symbols of fertility and prosperity. "Your marriage begins something new," Elena told them in English accented with the musical cadences of Apache. "Not Apache way, not white way, but your way. Make it strong, make it good. Make it example for others who may follow." The wedding feast that followed featured both frontier cooking and traditional Apache dishes prepared by Itzel and her cousins. As the sun set and the celebration wound down, Tom found himself thinking about Elena's words about beginning something new. Their marriage was indeed unprecedented in his experience, a genuine partnership between equals that defied easy categorization. That night, as he and Itzel settled into their shared bed as husband and wife, Tom reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them together. Less than a month ago, he had been a solitary bachelor focused entirely on the practical challenges of running a small ranch. Now he was a married man embarking on an adventure that would test everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the possibility of building bridges across cultural divides. "Are you afraid?" Itzel asked softly, perhaps sensing his reflective mood. "Terrified," Tom admitted, "but not of you, or us, or what we're building together. I'm afraid of the people who won't understand what we have, and what they might try to do to destroy it." Itzel was quiet for a moment, her head resting on his shoulder as they listened to the night sounds of the desert coyotes calling in the distance, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the eternal sigh of wind across the landscape. "In Apache tradition," she said finally, "we believe that some things are meant to be, regardless of the obstacles that try to prevent them. We call it the path of the heart, when two people find each other despite all the reasons they should remain apart. And you think that's what this is?" "I think," Itzel said with a smile in her voice, "that you found me sleeping in your barn for a reason that had nothing to do with accident or coincidence. I think we were meant to find each other, meant to build this new thing together, meant to prove that love is stronger than the fears that divide people." Tom kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and the faint fragrance of the sage and sweetgrass from their wedding ceremony. "Then I guess we better make sure we live up to that destiny." Outside their window, the desert spread away under a canopy of stars that had witnessed thousands of years of human struggle, love, loss, and hope. Tonight, those ancient stars were shining down on something genuinely new, a marriage that represented not the victory of one culture over another, but the possibility of creating something better than either culture could achieve alone. The first real test of their marriage came 6 weeks after the wedding, in the form of a dust cloud on the eastern horizon that resolved itself into a column of cavalry soldiers riding toward Tom's ranch with the purposeful urgency that usually meant trouble. Tom and Itzel were working together in the garden when they spotted the approaching riders. Without needing to discuss it, they both understood the potential danger of the situation. Relations between the military and Apache communities remained tense, and a white rancher married to an Apache woman occupied a precarious position that could be seen as suspicious by overzealous officers. "How many?" Itzel asked, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Looks like a full patrol. Maybe 20 men. Tom wiped soil from his hands and mentally calculated the distance to his rifle, which was leaning against the porch rail of the house. "Led by someone with lieutenant's bars." From the look of his uniform, Itzel straightened to her full height, and Tom could see her transforming from ranch wife to Apache princess, her posture and expression taking on the dignity that had impressed him from their first meeting. "I will not hide," she said quietly but firmly. "I wouldn't ask you to." Tom took her hand, finding comfort in her steady strength. "We're married, legal and proper. We have nothing to be ashamed of and nothing to apologize for." The cavalry patrol rode up to their fence line and halted in perfect military formation. The lieutenant in command was a young man, probably in his mid-20s, with the kind of spotless uniform and rigid bearing that marked him as someone still trying to prove himself worthy of his rank. "Good morning," Tom called out with careful courtesy. "Can I help you gentlemen with something?" The lieutenant's eyes moved from Tom to Itzel, and his expression shifted from polite inquiry to something much colder and more suspicious. I'm Lieutenant Crawford, United States Cavalry. We're conducting a sweep of this area looking for hostile Apache, who may have left the reservation without authorization. Haven't seen any hostiles around here, Lieutenant. Just me and my wife working our ranch. Crawford's gaze lingered on Itzel with obvious disapproval. Your wife appears to be Indian. Apache, Itzel said before Tom could respond, her voice carrying the quiet pride that he had learned to love and respect. I am Itzel Brennan, daughter of Chief Nalnish of the Chiricahua Apache. The lieutenant's hand moved toward his sidearm at the mention of Chiricahua Apache, a band known throughout the territory for producing some of the most effective resistance leaders. And what is a Chiricahua Apache doing on a white man's ranch instead of on the reservation where she belongs? Tom felt his temper rising at the officer's tone, but Itzel squeezed his hand in a warning to let her handle the situation. I am here because this is my home, with my husband, living legally under territorial law. Legal or not, it's suspicious as hell. Crawford dismounted and approached them with the swagger of someone used to having his authority go unquestioned. How do we know you're not passing information to hostiles? How do we know this ranch isn't being used as a staging area for raids? Because, Tom said, his voice taking on the edge of controlled anger, my wife and I are law-abiding citizens who have never given anyone cause to question our loyalty to the territory. And because you're talking to a woman who chose to leave her people and marry a white man, which hardly suggests sympathy for hostile activities, Crawford looked back at his men, several of whom had dismounted and were spreading out in a search formation that suggested they intended to examine the ranch thoroughly whether Tom consented or not. I'm afraid I'm going to have to insist on searching your property, Mr. Brennan. Just to be thorough. It was not a request, and everyone present understood that refusal would be treated as evidence of guilt. Tom nodded, with as much grace as he could muster. Search away, Lieutenant. You won't find anything but ranch equipment and household goods. What followed was an hour of systematic humiliation as the soldiers went through every building on Tom's property, examining his possessions with the kind of intrusive thoroughness usually reserved for known criminals. They poked through Itzel's personal belongings, questioned the presence of Apache-made items among their household goods, and treated both of them with a barely concealed hostility that made Tom's jaw ache from the effort of remaining civil. The worst moment came when one of the soldiers found the traditional Apache wedding basket that Elena had given them, holding it up like evidence of a crime. Look what we found, Lieutenant. Indian ceremonial stuff. Crawford examined the basket with the intense scrutiny of someone looking for hidden weapons or secret messages. This is evidence of continued connection to Apache culture. Why would a loyal American citizen keep such things? Because, Itzel said with Arctic dignity, it was a wedding gift from a medicine woman who blessed our marriage. Because it represents the joining of two traditions into something new and beautiful. Because throwing away my heritage would not make me more loyal to my new country, only more diminished as a person. Her words carried such quiet power and obvious sincerity that even Crawford seemed momentarily taken aback. But his military training and racial prejudices quickly reasserted themselves. Mrs. Brennan, I'm going to have to ask you to accompany us back to the fort for questioning. There are too many irregularities here for me to ignore. Tom stepped between Crawford and Itzel, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Like hell she is. My wife isn't going anywhere without a warrant or formal charges. The tension in the yard ratcheted up immediately, with soldiers reaching for their weapons and Tom calculating the odds of getting himself and Itzel to cover before the shooting started. For a moment, violence seemed inevitable. Then Itzel stepped forward, placing herself between her husband and the military patrol with the fearless grace that had first captured Tom's attention. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone born to leadership and tempered by hardship. Lieutenant Crawford, you have searched our home and found nothing suspicious. You have questioned our loyalty and found no evidence of wrongdoing. What you have found is an Apache woman who chose to marry a white man and make a life within your territorial system rather than fighting against it. She gestured toward the neat ranch around them, the productive garden, the well-maintained buildings that spoke of industry and investment in a peaceful future. This is not the home of people plotting against the United States government. This is the home of people building something that serves as an example of what is possible when different peoples choose cooperation over conflict. Crawford studied her face, and Tom could see him struggling between his preconceptions and the obvious evidence before his eyes. Here was not the savage warrior woman of military propaganda, but an intelligent, articulate person who had chosen integration over resistance. Furthermore, Itzel continued, if you take me for questioning without cause or evidence, you will be violating the rights that territorial law guarantees to all married women, regardless of their ancestry. My husband has connections throughout this region, and such an action would not go unnoticed or unchallenged. It was a diplomatic but unmistakable threat, delivered with the calm confidence of someone who understood both the law and the political realities of frontier life. Crawford looked uncertainly at his men, then back at Tom and Itzel, clearly realizing that he had overplayed his hand. After a long moment, the lieutenant stepped back and holstered his weapon. Very well, Mrs. Brennan, but I want to make it clear that this ranch will be watched. Any suspicious activity, any evidence of contact with hostile Apache, and we'll be back with more than just questions. You're welcome to watch, Tom said evenly. You'll see a man and woman working their land, raising their cattle, and building a life together. Nothing more, nothing less, as the cavalry patrol rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and wounded pride in their wake. Tom put his arm around Itzel and felt her trembling slightly with the aftermath of controlled fear and anger. That was brilliantly handled, he told her. The way you stood up to him, I've never seen anything like it. Itzel leaned against him, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability after the confrontation. I was terrified, but I have learned that sometimes showing fear to men like that is more dangerous than showing strength. What happens now? He meant what he said about watching us. Now we prove that what we told him is true. We live quietly, work hard, and build something so obviously good and peaceful that even suspicious cavalry officers can't argue with it. Itzel looked up at him with eyes that held both determination and love. And we prepare for the next test, because there will be others. The harassment that followed Lieutenant Crawford's visit was subtle but persistent. Military patrols began making regular stops at their ranch, always with polite excuses about watering their horses or checking for Apache sign, but clearly intended to intimidate and gather intelligence. Tom's neighbors became noticeably cooler, and several business associates found reasons to terminate relationships that had been profitable for both parties. But the most painful rejection came from an unexpected source. Tom was in town buying supplies when he encountered Father Miguel, the elderly Mexican priest who had ministered to the region's spiritual needs for 20 years. Tom had always respected the old man's wisdom and compassion, and had expected him to be understanding about his marriage to Itzel. Thomas, my son, Father Miguel said as they met outside the general store, I have been hoping to speak with you about your recent domestic arrangements. My marriage, you mean? Tom kept his voice level, though he could sense disapproval in the priest's manner. Yes, I understand you have taken an Indian woman as your wife. Father Miguel's English was accented with Spanish, and his weathered face showed the concern of someone genuinely worried about Tom's spiritual welfare. This troubles me deeply. Tom felt a surge of disappointment. He had hoped that a man of God would see past racial distinctions to the love and commitment that defined his relationship with Itzel. Father, my wife is a good woman. She's kind, hardworking, and devoted to building a Christian home. I would think those qualities would matter more than the color of her skin. But she is not Christian, is she? Father Miguel asked gently. She follows the pagan beliefs of her people. How can you build a Christian home with a woman who worships false spirits? She doesn't worship anything false. She believes in the same creator we do, just by a different name and through different traditions. Tom struggled to keep his voice respectful despite his growing anger. And she's never tried to interfere with my faith or prevent me from practicing it. The priest shook his head sadly. My son, marriage is a sacrament blessed by God for the union of Christian souls. What you have entered into may be legal under territorial law, but it cannot be blessed by the church unless your wife converts and renounces her heathen beliefs. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Father Miguel expressing genuine concern for Tom's spiritual welfare while making it clear that Itzel would never be welcome in his church unless she abandoned everything that connected her to her Apache heritage. When it ended, Tom felt as if he had lost not just a spiritual advisor but a friend he had counted on for understanding and guidance. That evening, as he related the conversation to Itzel, Tom could see the pain his words caused her despite her attempt to remain stoic. They were sitting on their porch watching the sunset, a nightly ritual that had become one of the most treasured parts of their shared life. I'm sorry, Tom said, taking her hand. I had hoped he would be different, better. Itzel was quiet for a long time, staring out at the desert landscape that glowed like burnished copper in the evening light. He is afraid, she said finally. Fear makes good people do cruel things, and cruel people do terrible things. What is he afraid of? The same thing Lieutenant Crawford is afraid of. The same thing your neighbors who have stopped speaking to you are afraid of. Itzel turned to look at him directly. They are afraid that what we represent, the possibility that their enemies are really just people like themselves, will force them to question everything they believe about who deserves respect and who deserves hatred. Tom nodded, understanding the deeper truth of what she was saying. Their marriage challenged fundamental assumptions about racial superiority, cultural compatibility, and the nature of civilized society. By succeeding as a couple, they were inadvertently threatening the ideological foundations that justified discrimination and violence against Apache people. So what do? Keep our heads down and hope they leave us alone? No, Itzel said with the quiet determination that he had come to recognize as her most essential quality. We do exactly what we have been doing. We live with dignity, work with purpose, love with our whole hearts, and prove by our example that a better way is possible. She stood up and moved to lean against the porch railing, her profile silhouetted against the deepening sky. And we prepare for the child who will be born before winter comes. Tom felt the world shift around him as the meaning of her words sank in. Child? We're going to have a baby? Itzel smiled with the mysterious joy of women who carry new life within them. I have suspected for several weeks, but now I am certain. Our child will be born when the leaves change color, when the summer heat gives way to autumn coolness. Tom stood and went to her, placing his hands gently on her still flat stomach, while trying to absorb the magnitude of what she had just told him. They were going to be parents. Their love was going to create a new human being who would be both Apache and white, belonging fully to both worlds and to neither. Are you happy? Itzel asked, perhaps sensing his complex emotions. I'm terrified and thrilled and overwhelmed all at the same time, Tom admitted. This changes everything, doesn't it? Everything. She agreed. Now we are not just building a life for ourselves. We are building a world for our child. And our child's children. The stakes have become much higher. That night, as they lay in bed discussing names and possibilities, and the future they would create for their coming child, Tom realized that their marriage had just evolved from a personal relationship into something much more significant. They were no longer just a white man and Apache woman who had fallen in love despite the obstacles. They were now the founders of a new kind of family that would challenge every assumption their society held about race, culture, and belonging. The responsibility was daunting, but as he listened to Itzel's steady breathing and felt the warmth of her body beside him, Tom felt equal to whatever challenges lay ahead. They had already overcome so much together. Surely they could overcome whatever trials parenthood would bring. The pregnancy transformed their already remarkable relationship in ways both profound and practical. Itzel, despite dealing with morning sickness and the fatigue that came with carrying new life, threw herself into preparing for their child with the same thoroughness she brought to everything else. She began gathering materials and knowledge for Apache traditions surrounding childbirth, consulting with Elena and her cousins through the informal network that connected scattered Apache communities. At the same time, she read every book about pregnancy and childcare that Tom could acquire from the territorial library, determined that their child would benefit from the best of both cultures' wisdom about raising healthy, strong children. Tom found himself marveling at her ability to blend seemingly contradictory approaches into a coherent philosophy of parenting. She prepared traditional Apache herbal remedies, while also insisting on having a white doctor examine her monthly. She planned to follow Apache customs for welcoming the child into the world, while also ensuring that the birth would be legally recorded according to territorial requirements. Our child will need to understand both worlds completely, she explained as she worked on a traditional Apache cradleboard, while also knitting blankets in the European style. The world is changing, and children who understand only one way of being will be at a disadvantage. As Itzel's pregnancy progressed and became visible, the reaction from their neighbors grew more complex and, in some cases, more hostile. The idea of a mixed-race child being born in their community challenged racial boundaries that many considered sacred and inviolable. The crisis came to a head during Itzel's 6th month, when Dr. Samuel Harrison, the only physician within 50 miles, refused to continue treating her. Tom had brought Itzel to town for her monthly examination, a routine they had established to ensure both mother and child remained healthy. But when they arrived at Dr. Harrison's office, they found the door locked and a sign directing patients to make appointments in advance. That's strange, Tom said, checking his pocket watch. "We have a standing appointment at this time every month." When they knocked, Dr. Harrison's voice came through the door. "Office is closed. Come back tomorrow." "Doc, it's Tom Brennan. We're here for Itzel's appointment." A long silence followed, then the sound of footsteps moving away from the door. Tom knocked again, louder this time, and eventually the doctor appeared, but he only opened the door wide enough to show his face. "I'm sorry, Tom, but I can't continue treating your wife." Tom felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. "What do you mean you can't continue treating her? Is there something wrong with the pregnancy?" Dr. Harrison looked deeply uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with both of them. "There's nothing wrong medically, but I've been advised that treating your wife sends the wrong message to the community about acceptable behavior." "Advised by whom?" Tom's voice was dangerously quiet. "It doesn't matter who. What matters is that I have other patients to consider, and my practice depends on community support." The doctor's face showed genuine regret, but also the fear of a man who felt trapped by circumstances beyond his control. "I'm sorry, Tom. I truly am. But I can't risk my livelihood for this situation." Tom felt Itzel's hand on his arm, restraining him from the angry response that was building in his chest. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried undertones of steel. "Dr. Harrison, I am 6 months pregnant with what will be the first child born of Apache and white parents in this territory. That child, and others like him or her, will be the future of this region whether you approve or not." Her dark eyes met his steadily. "Someday you will have to choose whether you were part of that future, or merely an obstacle to it." With that, she turned and walked away with the dignity of a queen, leaving both men staring after her in admiration and discomfort. That evening, as they discussed their limited options for medical care during the remaining months of pregnancy, Tom made a discovery that would change everything. While going through old papers in his desk, he found a letter he had received months earlier but had never opened correspondence from his cousin Edward in California. Edward Brennan was a successful lawyer in San Francisco who had made a fortune representing mining interests and railroad companies. The letter, when Tom finally read it, contained an offer he had dismissed as impractical when it first arrived but now seemed like a gift from Providence. "Edward wants me to come to California and manage his business interests in the agricultural valleys east of San Francisco," Tom told Itzel as he finished reading. "He says there are opportunities for ranchers who understand both cattle and farming, and he's offering to set us up with land and financing." Itzel looked up from the baby clothes she was sewing, her expression thoughtful. "California is far from Apache country, far from everything I have ever known, but it's also far from people who think our marriage is an abomination and our child is a mistake." Tom set the letter aside and went to sit beside her. "Edward mentions in his letter that California has families of many different backgrounds, Mexican, Chinese, Indian, and white, all living in the same communities. He says mixed marriages aren't uncommon, and mixed-race children aren't treated as curiosities or threats." Itzel was quiet for a long time, her hands resting on her growing belly as she considered the possibility of uprooting their lives and starting over in a place where their family might be accepted rather than merely tolerated. "What about this ranch? Everything you have built here?" Tom looked around at the home they had created together, the improvements they had made, the garden they had planted, the life they had carved out of the desert wilderness. Leaving would mean abandoning years of work and dreams of establishing something permanent in the Arizona territory. But as he watched Itzel sewing tiny clothes for their unborn child, he realized that home was not about buildings or land. Home was about the people you loved and the future you were building together. "I built this place thinking it would be my legacy," he said finally. "But now I understand that our child is our real legacy, and our child deserves to grow up in a place where he or she can be proud of both parents and both cultures." Itzel looked up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears. "Are you certain? Leaving will mean starting over completely." Tom took her hands in his, feeling the strength that had first drawn him to her and the softness that had grown from their love for each other. "I'm certain that I want our child to grow up in a place where an Apache princess and a broken-down cavalry officer can build something beautiful together without apologizing to anyone for it." That night, as they made plans for a journey that would take them away from everything familiar toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Tom reflected on the strange path that had led them to this moment. Less than a year ago, he had been a solitary man whose greatest ambition was to run a successful ranch. Now he was preparing to leave that ranch behind for the chance to build something even more valuable, A family that would prove love was stronger than the prejudices that divided people. The journey to California took 6 weeks and nearly cost them everything, including their lives. They traveled with a small wagon train of families heading west, but Itzel's pregnancy and their mixed marriage made them pariahs among most of their fellow travelers. They were forced to camp apart from the main group, to fetch their own water, and to endure suspicious stares and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when they approached. The physical challenges of the journey were compounded by Itzel's advancing pregnancy. At 7 months, she was large enough to be uncomfortable on the long days of travel, and Tom worried constantly about the effect of the rough roads and primitive camping conditions on both mother and child. But it was an attack by road agents near the Colorado River that nearly ended their dreams before they could reach their destination. The wagon train was stretched out along a narrow canyon road when the bandits struck 6 men with rifles and bandanas covering their faces, positioned on the rocks above the trail where they could fire down at the defenseless travelers. The attack came at midday, when the heat was worst and everyone was focused on just enduring the next mile of desert. "Everyone down!" shouted the wagon master as bullets began kicking up dust around the lead wagon. "Take cover and return fire." Tom pushed Itzel down behind their wagon and grabbed his rifle, joining the other men in returning fire at the barely visible figures on the ridge above. But the bandits had chosen their position. Well, they were protected by rocks, while the travelers were exposed on the open road. The firefight continued for nearly an hour, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Several of the travelers were wounded, including Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had been one of the few people to show kindness to Tom and Itzel during the journey. It was then that Itzel made a decision that demonstrated both her courage and her understanding of Apache warfare. While Tom was focused on the gun battle, she quietly slipped away from their wagon and began working her way up the canyon wall using handholds and ledges that the bandits hadn't thought to watch. Tom didn't realize what she was doing until he heard Apache war cries echoing from the ridge above, not the cries of attacking warriors, but the specific calls that Apache used to communicate during battle. The effect on the road agents was immediate and dramatic. Convinced that they were about to be attacked by Apache warriors, the bandits abandoned their positions and fled deeper into the mountains. When Tom found Itzel making her way back down the canyon wall, his relief at her safety was mixed with anger at the risk she had taken. "Are you completely insane?" he demanded, helping her down the last few feet to level ground. "You're 7 months pregnant, and you decided to go rock climbing while bullets were flying?" Itzel smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had solved a problem through cleverness rather than force. Apache children learn to climb before they learn to walk, and sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make your enemies think they are fighting someone else. Her strategy had worked perfectly, but the incident served as a wake-up call about the dangers they still faced. The American West in 1885 was a violent place where law enforcement was sparse and justice often came at the end of a gun. Their journey to California was far from over, and they were traveling through country where their safety depended entirely on their own resources and ingenuity. The remainder of the trip passed without major incident, but by the time they reached the San Joaquin Valley, Itzel was exhausted and showing signs that the birth was not far away. Tom's cousin Edward met them in the town of Modesto with a wagon, a doctor, and the kind of warm welcome that had been notably absent throughout their journey. Edward Brennan was a successful man in his mid-40s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of making profitable deals in California's booming economy. But what struck Tom most immediately was his genuine acceptance of Itzel and their unconventional marriage. "Tom's told me wonderful things about you in his letters," Edward said to Itzel as he helped her from the wagon, "and I can see that his descriptions didn't do you justice." Dr. Margaret Chen, the Chinese-American physician that Edward had brought to examine Itzel, was another revelation. A woman doctor was unusual enough in frontier communities, but Dr. Chen's mixed heritage and calm competence made her an ideal choice for treating a patient whose own mixed marriage had caused so much controversy. "Your baby is healthy and will probably arrive within the next 2 weeks, Dr. Chen told them after her examination. "And from what I can see, both mother and child should do well if we can get them proper rest and nutrition." That evening, as they settled into the comfortable house that Edward had prepared for them on his ranch, Tom felt a sense of relief and anticipation, unlike anything he had experienced since Itzel had first told him about her pregnancy. "We made it," he told her as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the agricultural fields that stretched to the horizon. "We're finally somewhere our child can grow up without having to apologize for existing." Itzel rested her head on his shoulder, her hands cradling her swollen belly. "I can feel him moving," she said softly. "He knows he's almost ready to enter the world." "Him?" Tom raised an eyebrow. "You're certain it's a boy? Apache mothers know these things," Itzel replied with a smile. "He will be strong like his father, and wise like his grandmother, and he will grow up understanding that he belongs to all the worlds his parents have given him." 2 days later, their son was born during a thunderstorm that swept across the valley with the dramatic intensity that seemed to follow their family wherever they went. The birth was attended by Dr. Chen, Elena, who had traveled from Arizona to be present for her honorary granddaughter's delivery, and Edward's housekeeper, a Mexican woman named Rosa who had assisted at dozens of births over the years. When Tom first held his son, a healthy baby with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, he felt a completeness he had never imagined possible. This child represented everything they had sacrificed to build, a future where love mattered more than race, where strength came from embracing multiple cultures rather than rejecting them, and where two people from different worlds could create something entirely new and beautiful. "What will you call him?" Elena asked as she performed the traditional Apache blessing that would welcome the child into his mother's spiritual heritage. Tom and Itzel had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but looking at their son's alert, curious face, they both knew immediately what he should be called. "Samuel," Tom said, naming him for his own father. Samuel Standing Bear. Brennan, honoring both the grandfather he'll never meet and the Apache warrior tradition that will always be part of him. As they spoke his full name for the first time, baby Samuel opened his eyes and looked directly at his parents with the kind of intense gaze that seemed to understand more than any newborn should. In that moment, Tom knew that they had accomplished something extraordinary. They had created not just a child, but a bridge between worlds, a living symbol of what was possible when people chose love over fear. 5 years later, Tom stood in the same spot where he had first held his infant son, watching Samuel chase butterflies through the gardens that Itzel had planted around their California home. At 5 years old, the boy was already showing the blend of characteristics that would define his remarkable heritage: his father's curiosity and mechanical aptitude, combined with his mother's intuitive understanding of the natural world and her gift for languages. Samuel spoke English, Spanish, and Apache with equal fluency, switching effortlessly between them depending on whom he was addressing. He could help Tom repair machinery and tend cattle, assist Itzel in her herb garden, and charm Edward's business associates with his precocious intelligence and natural social grace. But it was the boy's effect on their community that truly amazed Tom. In a region where diversity was common but not always accepted, Samuel had become a kind of ambassador for the idea that mixed heritage was a strength rather than a weakness. His playmates included Mexican, Chinese, Irish, and Indian children, and their parents had gradually learned to see the Brennan family not as an oddity to be tolerated but as valuable members of their community. Edward's business ventures had prospered beyond anyone's expectations, with Tom's knowledge of ranching and Itzel's understanding of sustainable agriculture proving to be a formidable combination. They had expanded from cattle ranching into fruit orchards, vegetable farming, and even experimental crops that Itzel had adapted from Apache agricultural traditions. But their greatest success was less tangible and more profound. They had created a template for how families like theirs could thrive in the changing American West. Other mixed couples had begun settling in their valley, drawn by stories of a place where children could grow up proud of all their heritage, rather than ashamed of part of it. Dr. Chen had helped deliver 3 more mixed-race children in their community over the past 2 years, and Father Luis, a young Mexican priest who had replaced the region's elderly and less tolerant predecessor, had performed marriages between couples of different backgrounds without requiring anyone to abandon their cultural identity. "You have started something here that is bigger than just your own family," Elena told Tom and Itzel during one of her annual visits. The old medicine woman, now in her 70s, had become a regular fixture in their home and a beloved grandmother figure to Samuel. "Children like Samuel will be the future of this land. Not Apache, not white, not Mexican, but something new that takes the best from all traditions." As if summoned by their conversation about him, Samuel came running up to the porch where the adults were talking, his face bright with excitement and his hands cupped carefully around something precious. "Mama, Papa, look," he said in Apache, then switched to English for Elena's benefit. "I found a butterfly with 1 blue wing and 1 orange wing. Abuela Elena says that means he's special. Like me." Itzel knelt to examine her son's discovery while Tom marveled at the casual way the boy moved between languages and cultures, finding joy and meaning in his unique position rather than confusion or conflict. He is special indeed, Itzel told Samuel seriously. In Apache tradition, such a butterfly is a sign that different kinds of beauty can exist in the same creature, making it more beautiful than if all its parts were the same. Samuel nodded with the grave attention he gave to all of his mother's teachings, then carefully released the butterfly and watched it fly away toward the mountains. "Will I have children who are special like me?" he asked with the innocent directness of childhood. Tom and Itzel exchanged glances, both thinking of the conversations they had already begun having about Samuel's future, about the young woman he would someday choose to marry, about the grandchildren who would carry their mixed heritage forward into the next generation. "I think," Tom said carefully, "that you will have children who are special in their own way, just as you are special in yours, and they will grow up in a world that understands better than ours does that being different is not the same as being wrong." That evening, after Samuel had been tucked into bed with stories in 3 languages and blessings from multiple traditions, Tom and Itzel sat together on their porch as they had every night for the past 6 years. The ritual had begun in Arizona, continued through their dangerous journey, and evolved into a cherished time of reflection and connection in their California home. "Do you ever regret leaving Arizona?" Tom asked as they watched stars emerge in the clear evening sky. Itzel considered the question seriously, as she considered all important questions. "I regret that fear and hatred drove us away from the home we had built together. But I do not regret the choice to leave, because it brought us here, to this place where our son can grow up proud of everything he is." She leaned against Tom's shoulder, her head fitting perfectly into the space that seemed designed for her. "And I do not regret finding you sleeping in that barn all those years ago." Tom laughed at her reversal of their first meeting. "I believe I found you sleeping in my barn, not the other way around." "Did you?" Itzel asked with mock seriousness. "I remember it differently. I remember a lonely cowboy who needed someone to teach him that home is not a place you build, but people you choose to love." As they sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their adopted home and feeling the satisfaction that came from building something lasting and meaningful, Tom reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. He had begun as a solitary man, whose greatest ambition was to run a successful ranch and live quietly without bothering anyone. Through a series of choices that had seemed small at the time but had proven to be life-defining, he had become the founder of a new kind of American family, one that proved love was stronger than prejudice, that diversity was a source of strength rather than division, and that the future belonged to people brave enough to build bridges instead of walls. Samuel would grow up to become a successful businessman, a devoted father, and a leader in California's agricultural community. His children would carry their mixed heritage forward into the 20th century, contributing to the gradual transformation of American attitudes toward race and culture. And his descendants would spread across the West, each one carrying within them the legacy of an Apache princess and a cowboy who had chosen love over fear. But that night, as Tom and Itzel prepared for sleep in the home they had built together, they knew only that they had found something precious and rare, a love that had not only survived every test but had grown stronger with each challenge they had faced together. The woman Tom had found sleeping in his stable had indeed become his, just as he had become hers, in a partnership that had transformed them both and created something beautiful that would endure long after they were gone. Outside their window, the California night settled over the valley like a benediction, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Built on the foundation of love, they had laid together one choice, one challenge, one victory at a time. The end.